welcome again to these preparatory videos for the DigiPlace Transnational cluster on the 16th and 17th of June. This one is focused on session 2, so that's looking at the URBACT local group workshop, and I will just be talking through a bit about the local groups, how you can structure and think about them to get us ready for the more interactive and discursive parts that we'll cover during the actual DigiPlace session. So, looking at the local groups, the ULG as it's often referred to. In the most basic terms, the ULG is your local steering group within your city, but also your local working group. It's about actually being the engine room for your DigiPlace activity at a local level to sort of drive and shape all the work you're doing as part of the DigiPlace project. The idea being it's a collaborative group and being focused around the co-production of your integrated action plan as one of its key outputs that it's trying to achieve. But by no means the only one. There's a variety of different ways of using the ULG on a local level, and whilst it's created for DigiPlace and for URBACT and for the production of the IAP, it is by no means limited to working solely on those things. And in fact, the best examples are where the ULG grows into something far more effective and far more powerful than it's intended to, just in terms of a single purpose item. There are no set formats for a ULG, but there are some common practices and there are some effective practices. There's also some pitfalls, and we'll talk through some of these and explore some of these in the session during the transnational cluster, but I'll just talk through a little bit of principle now to help understand, get us to the same place in terms of where we're starting from. So the first question really is who is part of the ULG, or who should be part of it. So again, I've said it's not prescriptive. It's very much down to judgment and local circumstances, and it's also part of my role to help you explore and work out to get that best balance for your local context. So in theory, anyone who's relevant could be involved, and that's quite a broad term. Trying to be a bit more specific about it, it's normally about people or organizations who want change to happen within your city, within your context, but also people or organizations who have the potential to create that change as well. So some of the people who might be involved are those who are wanting to see some improvement for them or for the people they represent, or the organization they represent. But it could also be people who have parts of the puzzle, parts of the solution, or might be able to contribute something to making that change. And people might fall into one of those groups or both groups. They also might just be interested in what's going on and have some other relevant parts. So it's not prescriptive, as I say, in those senses. Just think about who it could possibly involve. And it's not limited just to organizations as well. It can be citizens and it can be communities as well, depending on the context. And also think about organizations or individuals who are not just in your local context, but also thinking about that context of integration, national government, regional representatives, neighboring municipalities as well. So keep those things in mind. And another key thing to look at is thinking about who are some of the unusual suspects. It's very easy to think, oh yeah, we know our stakeholders, and sometimes that's not always giving us the full view of who we might involve. So think about who are the ones we don't always expect to see at these sort of things. Who are the people who might be relevant to what we want to focus on, but actually their voice isn't being heard. So that's not just for the sake of being different, but to try and help bring alternative perspectives to the table, to highlight unheard views on problems or challenges, or give different insights, different expertise, or to give rise to new or alternative ideas that haven't been considered before. As part of that, think particularly about sort of the voice of the citizen or the voice of service users. Who's going to be the recipient of some of this change? Typically, they can be understated viewpoints. So think about who the change you're trying to create is for. Who are you trying to change things for? And do they actually want it, or do they want your version of what you're thinking about? Or how do they perceive the problem or opportunity that you're looking to tackle or looking to address? Do they have the same view as you? So again, just think widely about who might be involved, and try to avoid sticking to the sort of standard people you always come to for these sort of things. So once you've thought about and started to pull together your ULG, or you're thinking about who to involve, it's also worth thinking about what are some of the key functions of the group, what's its purpose. Now, again, this is not entirely prescriptive, and how you use your group is quite broad in terms of the things you can use that group for. But the three functions it particularly needs to cover is acting as the role of a steering group. So drawing in input from members and from other stakeholders outside the group, and coming to making joint decisions on the plan and the direction of travel and of the activities you want to do as a group and the focus you want to have. So it's like sort of direction and steering function. And there's a risk that you get stuck just with that aspect, and only becomes a talking shop and a steering group. Sometimes the trickier bit, and the thing you need to think about early on, is actually it should be a working group as well. This is the group that needs to be carrying out some of the project activities, building the action plan, identifying the resources, doing the analysis work on some of the challenges and problems, thinking about how it's all going to fit together, mobilizing other stakeholders or getting people on board. So you do need to be able to do things between the meetings, between the transnational meetings. You do need to be able to actually take action and move things along. It's not just a theoretical talking thing. It needs to be a doing group as well as a thinking group. But it doesn't mean you have to have the same people doing everything. You can have some people who've got more of a strategic function, some people more operate as a working function as well. And there's all sorts of things, and we'll get into this in the session, where you could create subgroups to look at particular tasks, or particular task and finish groups to deliver certain activities. So it's not to say you have to do everything as a single group. You can draw in the right people at the right time. And I'll talk about that in a little bit as well. But the third thing that often gets missed from the ULG is the fact that actually it's also a learning group. And what I mean by that is it's the group that tends to get most of the insights, get most of the development, and do most of the rethinking and working differently as part of an URBACT project. So that group will have a lot of opportunity to improve their local capability, or the capability of their organizations, to develop new ways of thinking, new mindsets, new skills, new processes, and apply new tools and new ways of working. But it's also important that that group recognizes that as a result, they have a responsibility in the city to also share some of those insights and to share that learning and transfer that learning. So it's critical that the group actively seeks to learn and seeks to develop its ability and its capabilities, but also that it seeks to share that learning and pass that out as well within the city. So consider these three aspects, consider who might need to be involved in each part, and consider also how they overlap and interconnect. They're not necessarily discrete functions. Certain activities contribute to more than one or other of those themes. So in practice, as I say, there's no fixed format or fixed model. But there are some common approaches. Now, you will have a core project team, comprised, broadly speaking, of your project coordinator, your local project lead, perhaps your communication officer, maybe finance, maybe your ULG coordinator as well. And you'll be doing a lot of the active work on the project, potentially. And then across the whole city, you've got the other end of the spectrum, where you've got all your stakeholders and everybody, including citizens, and whether that's about individuals, whether that's about community groups, organizations, and so on. But everybody has some relevant interest or input or opinion to have on the topic you're focusing on. And so they're two extremes of who you could involve in it. And then what you tend to end up with is, in reality, some key members who become part of your ULG, who are drawn from some of those organizations, some of those groups, to represent that large group on the right, in terms of that large group of stakeholders and citizens and so on. So you create your ULG to try and make it manageable, rather than trying to involve the entire city in everything you do. The ULG is there as a group to represent a wide range of views and to connect your work with others in their own organization or elsewhere in the city as well. So once you put your ULG together, always just remember that those stakeholders in the room are not necessarily all of the stakeholders that might exist across the city or across the region. So just remember who's in the room and think about who's not, and remember who's, for those are not in the room, are their views and are their opinions being represented. There's a danger that you form a closed group with your ULG, and actually it can become as insular as just working within your project team alone. So keep in mind that you need to be thinking about what's going on and what views are happening that isn't necessarily represented directly in the ULG. Also then thinking about how you operate and what scale you want your ULG. Do you just want a few people? Do you want loads? And this is always a point of debate, and there's different approaches and different principles to it. The thing to consider is that you're often trying to sort of strike the balance. There's always trade-offs between sort of short-term progress and the levels of participation and levels of co-production you can achieve. So you're always trying to strike the balance. And to just talk about sort of two extremes to illustrate the point. If you are working with real focus on your core team, where the project team makes all the main decisions, does all, has control over everything and just decides what they're going to do, that tends to prioritize sort of short-term progress and short-term activity over participation and cooperation. So by only having a few people, very small people, a number of people involved, you can make quick decisions, you can get on with stuff, you can do things quickly without having to weigh up lots of conflicting viewpoints and have to go out and talk to lots of people and involve lots of people. So that's optimized for quick progress, but it's not at all participative. And in reality, whilst it makes short-term progress, and there's a reason why I put short-term progress there, you have the perception of quick progress, but actually in the long term, the fact you're working in isolation means you don't create a good product, and you often don't deliver change that people actually want because you haven't taken that into that wider viewpoints into account, and you've got a very narrow focus of ideas. Now, I don't think anyone is advocating that you do that, but it's just to illustrate the point. If you just work with a core project team, it's very, very focused around immediate progress, but it's not at all participative. At the other end of the spectrum, you can optimize for participation and co-production. Involve all stakeholders in all aspects of everything. Get everyone always involved the whole time, always seeking opinions, doing collaborative decision-making, and so on. And that's great for participation. It's very participative if you do it well. But it's also very, very slow. Involving that many people means you have to, every time you get a new opinion, you have to go out to everybody and so on and so forth. And anyone who's done any serious participative or co-production work in the past will know that there is a bit of a trade-off in striking that balance, that if you do a lot of engagement, a lot of co-production, unless you're very experienced at it, and the whole system, the whole set of stakeholders is very experienced at it, and you have a clear framework for it, it can take a very long time to do, and it can almost bog things down, get things so bogged down that you just stop and you make no progress at all. So that sort of approach where you throw it open to everybody is very participative, but it can be very, very slow or completely stop projects entirely. So what you're trying to aim for is ending up with somewhere where you are striking the balance. You've got progress, but you've also got participation. And that's the rationale for the ULG. It's trying to get a balance between not just being a tiny little team that is not participative, but not being so broad that it's unmanageable. And that is a local judgment, and that is all the way through. It's going to have to be a local judgment. What works in one city will not work in another city, for example. We have to adapt, and we have to look at the local context and the circumstances in terms of the stakeholders and also in terms of the aims and what you want to achieve. And that's part of what we'll do as part of this network, is support each other to develop our ULGs to be the right balance and to strike that balance. So it's trying to find the key members so you can make progress but still be participative. And it's also remembering that that doesn't have to be fixed all the way through. You don't have to say, this is our ULG and now it's closed and shut and that's it. And this set of people always do the same things. There's certain parts of the process where you might want to expand those involved in the ULG activities to include a wider group. Equally, there's certain tasks where you'll say, actually, we want to involve a smaller number of people because it needs to be a bit more focused and we don't need a wide level of participation. So it's remembering that participation isn't just about the size of the group, but it's also about the activities that are going on. You can throw something open very wide, but still not be very participative. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. But we're trying to get that balance. That's the key point here. So in that sense, you also need to think about involving the right people at the right time, just developing that thought a bit further. So at different stages of the project, you might have a different open or closeness about, or a wide or narrow group in terms of who you're working with actively. So it's not to say you actively exclude people, but it might be in terms of particular bits of work, you're working in a broader group or working in a smaller group. So for example, at the start of your project, you're probably going to be working with the core project team as you're first starting things up. Before we've even established the ULG, you need to start somewhere, quite often. This is an example, by the way. This is not a hard and fast rule of what should happen, but it's just to illustrate the point. As you then start to identify the themes you want to focus on, you start to identify key ULG members, you broaden the group out, you start working with a large number of people. When you want to go right out and explore the details of that and get lots of information, you might throw that right open, and people and doing an open call or open invite for people to share their opinions or offer their expertise or whatever. So at that point, you might throw the process really wide open and involve a lot of people. But having done that, you might want to take all that, synthesize it down just within the ULG again, and sort of use a tighter group again to define some specific problems you want to focus on. From that, you might throw it open again to say, okay, we want to generate some ideas based on those specific problems that we've refined, but throw it open again to a wider group and to engage more people in it. From there, you might get those ideas and then have a really tight group to refine it down to specific project ideas or to really specifically test things. And you want a really focused, tight group to be able to really get through and to make some specific propositions on that. From that, you may then say, okay, we'll do a wider group to then validate and run those test projects. So slightly bigger than the ULG. And then as you come together and get the results of those test projects, you'll go back to your core ULG members to do the drafting work on the integrated action plan. So this is purely illustrative. This is not a rule of how you have to do it, but it's just to show that you can involve different people at different stages of the process. So as you step through different stages or doing different activities, you might include more or fewer people in that process. In terms of co-producing the integrated action plan, there's some processes around co-production, which we'll talk about at a later point. And the URBACT local group is the core part for doing that. And it's trying to get into a situation, looking just the simple model in terms of what co-production or co-design is, as opposed to coercing or educating, which is very much more one way and is not participative. So the things down the bottom of this little diagram here are the sort of non-participative activities. The things at the top are the more participative activities. And we're aiming to be as far up this as we possibly can be. So it's moving away from doing to and up to doing with. So our ULG is a construct to try and help us strike that balance that I talked about, and to enable us to be co-designing and co-producing things as part of the process. When we throw it open a bit wider, involving a large number of stakeholders, we're more likely to be operating in the sort of engaging or consulting mode. It's very difficult to do true co-design or co-production in a wide group like that. So if we are throwing things open, it's being aware that we're probably operating in this bit, but that's fine because we've got our ULG as the construct and the model there for doing true co-design, and we know that the views of this wide group are represented and the opinions are being included in there as well. And it is not just a purely take opinions and work in the project team. You've got a wide group in terms of the design, but there's always a balance to strike here, and it's just the thing to think about as we go through. The thing we need to watch and avoid is getting stuck in the situation down the bottom here where you just end up working in the core project team, because then you will end up really being far away from participative processes, because the only people that can participate are the ones in the team. So in terms of the recipients of service, the beneficiaries of change, they will be out here. They will not be getting involved in it if you're in this sort of model. It's also worth noting just at this point that you can drift into your ULG being quite closed if you're not careful. So you can create a group, but you can still work in a coercive and educating mode within your ULG if you keep it too tight and you keep it too close and you don't allow participation and opinions from outside that core group. There's still a risk that at a city level it's still not participative. So that's just a thing to watch. And what you want to almost aim for is making sure you're keeping a slightly permeable boundary around your ULG. So it's not closed and hidden, it's still open, it's working in the open, it's sharing what's happening, it's involving different people at different times. It's perhaps even a fluid structure and a fluid set of people involved. So by doing that, you can effectively move away from having operating down that bottom end at all, and you're kind of spending most of your time in this, ideally we're doing with, but hopefully no less than doing for, but keeping as much of it up this end as possible. Just linking that then in terms of, that's thinking about how the participative nature of it works. There's also an important bit to link in with the integrated approach, which is another key pillar of URBACT. You've got the participation angle, but also the integrated angle. I've talked about this in the other video for the preparing for the first session. So if you haven't watched that already, check that out because it'll explain this part here. It's just to go and look at that first if you're not familiar with the integrated approach. And the key point is the ULGs are intended to reflect the integrated nature of the action plans. So the fact we're trying to take an integrated approach to the working and the design of the actions, the ULGs are supposed to, as a rationale, reflect that and enable all those different cooperations to happen within the local group and within the local city. So the ULG members could represent any or all of those different cooperation areas. And people will be drawn from those different areas as part of participating in that group. So that's just the key thing to remember, that that's one of the key mechanisms for ensuring that is actually thinking about the integrated approach when you identify your stakeholders is really key if you want to have an integrated action plan at the end of the process. If you don't draw people from the right areas, your action plan by default is unlikely to be integrated, or it won't be deliverable because those who are required to help deliver it from other sections won't be on board with the process. In terms of identifying those stakeholders, I've shared with quite a few of you now, certainly all the project leads from each city. We've now got on Miro some stakeholder tools that we can use to identify, and these mirror some physical world tools that we've used often in URBACT. So you can use those to think about identifying the stakeholders, or if you haven't done so already, I know some of you are already a fair way through working in your local groups. But remember, this is an ongoing process, so don't think of it as a fixed process. Different stages might require different people. And if you haven't really done it as a process, also think about who are those unusual suspects that you actually could be getting some benefit from, but you just haven't brought in or haven't observed before. So think about that as an ongoing process. You can keep revisiting this and saying, does this still hold? Is this still valid, this how we've mapped it out before? Another key thing to remember is as you're going through the process, and I'll talk about the process and the stages in the roadmap video and in the roadmap session, but just to step through, if you've got your stakeholders together, you've formed your ULG, we've done some work, even with your unusual suspects, to define what problems you want to tackle. The thing to remember then is that sometimes throws up new information and new perspectives, and you may need to go back and revisit your stakeholders, having defined the problem. So don't see it as fixed. And the thing to remember with all of this is that when identifying stakeholders, we're not just talking about ULG members. Keep that in mind, that this mapping process is not just for finding out who to be in your ULG. It's a really good tool for that, but you should have some people on your stakeholder mapping that are not part of your ULG, but they are stakeholders nonetheless, and you should have them visible, and you should know who they are, and you should have deliberately made the decision that they're not part of the ULG, but you are going to work with them and interact with them in other ways that aren't having them directly involved in the ULG all the time, for example. But that's the last key important point, is to remember that stakeholders in ULG are not groups that completely overlap. Or they do overlap, but they're not completely contiguous. So you will have some stakeholders that are not in your ULG, for example, and just keep that in mind as you go through. The last point just to highlight is that the thing with the ULGs, the other main function they have is to create the links between the local and the transnational working. So the ULGs form what's often referred to as a sort of almost like a two-way bridge between the local work and the transnational exchange. So at a local level, you want to be preparing together before transnational sessions, and you want to be reflecting, reviewing afterwards, and taking action afterwards as a group as a result of those sessions. And that's quite important, because otherwise you end up with two non-meeting parallel things. You have transnational activity and you have local activity, and never the two meet. So the ULGs and along with the project team are key in making that transition and helping things move between the two levels. So just to illustrate that, this is a snippet from the detailed project plan. And just to think about, this is where we are now with the DigiPlace transnational cluster in terms of the activation work at the sort of network level. So you've got the network level across the top, and then you've got the local level running down beneath it. So following this DigiPlace cluster, you'll be wanting to have a ULG meeting or a similar process to debrief and reflect what's come out of this session, and what does that mean for either consolidating your group further or developing it, or getting on with some of the activity. So particularly thinking about drafting the IIP roadmaps is something you want to be thinking about. You might also be taking some other local activity as well, and we'll be working together to help define that. So that helps to bring the content from the transnational work back into the local level. And the ULG has a role of thinking about what does it mean and how do we use that locally? What actions can we take as a result of that? Thinking about that third category, about being a learning group as well as a steering group. But then as you move towards the next DigiPlace cluster in the autumn, you'll also be thinking about making sure that regardless of what else happens, you've got a focused meeting with your ULG or a focused process for feeding into that cluster, for preparing for it. What do we want to contribute? What do we want to get out of it? How are we going to use this opportunity of transnational exchange? And then again, following that, those transnational sessions, how does that then locate back into our local context and our local work? What will we do differently? What actions will we take as a result of that transnational experience? And how will we share that learning with other people in our city? So again, we'll talk about that in more detail as we go through the sessions and through the project in general. For now, just reminding you of the three main functions that we're talking about in the ULG, being as a steering group, as a working group, and also as a learning group. So they're the main things to keep in mind in terms of how you constitute your ULG, but we'll go into that in some detail in the working session during the transnational cluster. So thank you for listening again, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Bye.